This is Your Morning Basket, where we help you bring truth, goodness, and beauty to your homeschool day. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 45 of the Your Morning Basket podcast. I'm Pam Barnhill, your host, and I'm so happy that you're joining me here today as we kick off a new season of the podcast. We're really excited to have author S.D. Smith of Green Ember fame with us today on the show. We're going to be talking about the importance of story, what makes a good story, and how stories work to form and shape us throughout our entire lives. So we'll get on with that interview right after this word from our sponsor. This episode of the Your Morning Basket podcast is brought to you by Maestro Classics. Would you like to bring classical music into your children's lives? You can add classical music to your morning time today with Maestro Classics. These award-winning CDs and MP3s feature storytellers Yadu and Jim Weiss, accompanied by the world-famous London Philharmonic Orchestra. Choose from a dozen titles, including Peter and the Wolf, The Nutcracker, and one of the Barnhill family favorites, The Story of Swan Lake. What makes Maestro Classic CDs so special is that each CD and MP3 contains a 24-page activity book with illustrations, puzzles, games, and fun facts for kids. You can download free curriculum guides that combine classical music with science, math, geography, and other subjects. All CD and MP3 sets include tracks which explain to your children how the music was made, who the composer was, the history and story behind the music, the instruments used by the orchestra, and most importantly, how to open your ears and really listen. Listening is a learned art, and Maestro Classics guarantees that these recordings will explain and develop listening skills in your children. Visit maestroclassics.com for free shipping on all CDs and MP3s. They start at just $9.98. As a Your Morning Basket listener, you can receive 17% off your order by using coupon code PAM at checkout. Go to www.maestroclassics.com. That's Maestro, spelled M-A-E-S-T-R-O, classics.com, where the best classical music curriculum awaits your homeschool. And now, on with the podcast. S.D. Smith lives with his wife Gina and their 4 children in his native West Virginia. He is the author of fan favorites The Green Ember and its sequel, Ember Falls, as well as The Black Star of Kingston and a brand new adventure, The Last Archer, a Green Ember story. He is also a co-founder of Storywarren, which strives to help parents foster holy imagination in the children they love. Sam's stories plant seeds of truth, beauty, and goodness in the hearts of readers young and old, and he joins us on the podcast to chat about how the stories we read in morning time can mold and shape our families. Sam, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Pam. It is wonderful to be here with you today. I started to say this morning, but it's not. We're talking about morning time, but it's not necessarily. It could be any nondescript time right now.
That's right. It could be any nondescript time, and it just happens to be the afternoon.
That's right.
Well, we're so excited to have you. We love the Green Ember and those stories, and so it's a lot of fun to get to chat with you about stories. And I know that I've listened to you. I've had the great honor to sit and listen to you tell stories before, and you're a fabulous storyteller. But let's think back to some of your earliest memories of stories. How have they shaped your life?
Stories did help shape me pretty early on, I think. But it's funny, it's sort of in a non-traditional way. Like, I think a lot of homeschooling families, and my family is certainly like this, like the kids are just all into stories and they're reading all the time. And some slower than others. You know, we've had a couple kids that were just like insanely fast and speaking big words at super young ages and, you know, blowing away the people at grocery stores who were worried about their socialization with their massive words. But we've had others that have been kind of slow to read. But my family's definitely right now very shaped by stories, storytelling, and reading independent and collectively. But for me, when I grew up, I'm 40 years old. And when I grew up in a very small rural area of Appalachia, I guess it's pretty much all rural, but this was especially rural. And I lived in a holler. We called it a holler. We weren't even sophisticated enough to say hollow. We called it a holler. And my dad said we lived so far back in the woods that no one lived behind us. That was actually a cool spark to my imagination because early on I was like, is that possible? How does no one live behind us? I thought, that's amazing. And I just wanted to go back and see if there was anybody back there. But I never did see anyone else, so it could be true. But so I didn't read as a young boy. I didn't see a lot of males, a lot of boys I was in school with or peers that were really readers. And so that was something that a lot of girls did. But I always had this sort of, I don't know if it was a love-hate, but I had this complicated relationship with storytelling. My mom would, so I never had sort of like a lot of desire to go read myself when I was really little. But my mom would read to us. She read the Chronicles of Narnia, and I know it's cliche, but I don't care. It's amazing, amazing stuff, and I love it today as much as I did then as a little boy sitting in the basement of a half-built log cabin that my father never finished building before we went to the mission field, and listening to these stories of Aslan and Lucy and the rest of the Pevensey kids. And so those stories just really shaped my imagination and formed me. And one thing that was really great about where we lived was we did live back in a hollow between mountains, a lot of mountains in West Virginia. We are the mountain state. And we had a lot of hills and woods and caves and that kind of stuff. So I played all the time. So I had this sort of scope for my imagination was really, really powerful. And the stories that I did get, we would live them out playing in the hills, around our home. And so I was really, really shaped by the Chronicles of Narnia and the Boxcar Children and Lassie. And then even, things I would see visually like Star Wars and Star Trek and that kind of thing also had a sort of a big impact on me really early on. It was very, very powerful for me. Maybe as powerful or more powerful than any other influence were the stories that I heard as a child.
Well, you mentioned the mission field. When you guys I know you spent some time with your family in Africa. When you guys were there, did you experience any storytelling over there? Because I know that those cultures over there have a long tradition of a long oral tradition of not so much writing down stories, but passing stories orally.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are so many, it's different. In America, we feel really divided, maybe even particularly now we feel like, oh my goodness, we're such a divided people. And we are, I think, in some important ways. But there's an amazing cultural unity in the United States in a lot of ways compared to, say, South Africa has 11 official languages, the country I lived in, and there are far, far, far more in use. Probably hundreds. And so there are Zulu, there are Xhosa, there's Sotho, there are Ndebele, there are English, there's Afrikaans, so there are all kinds of tribes. There's two European tribes, the English and the Afrikaners, which are kind of Dutch. And so it's just a very diverse culture. And they call themselves the Rainbow Nation. And so they've got so many cultures that have incredible storytelling traditions, all of them. But I was particularly taken with, and where I lived was really close to the Zulu, where mostly Zulu folks lived. And so my father helped plant a Zulu church with another Zulu pastor. And so I was out there all the time in the Madadeni township. And so those stories of the Zulu people really got in my heart for sure. No question. And if you've ever read a book, you can kind of understand some of the musicality, some of the beauty of the Zulu people and their story. If you read a book called Cry the Beloved Country. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've read that.
I haven't, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. You would love it. I'm sure it's a beautiful book. And that definitely had a shaping influence. Not so much on me, again, reading a lot of stories myself, but I feel like I sort of fell in love. I didn't really know what love was, so to speak, but I love the Zulu people and I love the African sky. And somehow mixing that experience of being in Africa with inheritance of growing up in Appalachia in West Virginia, both of which were really, really strong influences. The sort of the melding of those two things probably explains why I'm so weird. I think that's probably a good reason.
Well, let's talk about becoming a parent and how parenthood has changed the way that you think about and experience stories. So, when you were a kid, you heard these wonderful stories and you played them out in your life. So how has it changed now that you've become a parent?
I don't know if you've had this experience too, but it feels to me like it's just that I'm beginning to see what was always there about the power of storytelling that I didn't realize. I think even more so than becoming an author and writing stories myself, was the storytelling, the power of the storytelling moments I have with my kids. And that's really where the whole sort of career, if you will, has come from. It's from telling stories to my kids and then those being shared more broadly. But it started at home. And I guess I just see the power more because, it's like as a parent, you're looking at your kids and you see something that's not great, like an attitude or a habit. And it's very convicting, partly because of, your role in shepherding and loving them, but also, you see yourself and you see, oh my goodness, oh, that's, that is so annoying, that habit. And it's just like me. And so and I guess you just sort of can see in a new way because you've got this new role of being responsible of having this stewardship. And I just believe very firmly that my family is the first province of my stewardship in the world, and that if I fail there, then that's more catastrophic than failing anywhere else. And I want to fail there last or not at all, if possible, because I want to be a good dad and I want to be a good husband and I want to do well at home and not to say perfect or anything like that. We're far from that, but I feel so what it feels like is we were always in a war, but I didn't know it. And now I know it. And it feels like good stories that shape the imagination, that spark desire for goodness and for heroic virtue. Like now I just see them as this big artillery cache, that we've found all these weapons and oh my goodness, we've got stuff we can fight this war in. And I don't mean to reduce it to sort of just battle language, but that's just kind of a serious metaphor, I guess. And that's how I feel about being a parent, about being a father, is that this is more intense than anything else in my life as far as what I feel called to and what I want to succeed at. So stories just feel like good stories and good storytellers. When I read the Chronicles of Narnia to my kids, when I read other stories from Tolkien or from Chesterton or from modern authors like Jonathan Rogers or others, Sally Lloyd Jones, I think of, wow, that's just more artillery coming in for the fight. So as a parent, I just feel like it feels more precious to me, even just divorced from sort of my own vocation or calling as a storyteller. I just see it as so valuable and crucial, like that there are a few other things that I feel shape my kids' imaginations and who they want to be, like storytelling. And I guess I can just see it now. I just feel like I can see it. And so I want to rally the troops however I can.
Yeah, you're so right. Just the idea that when we have nothing else, and, Cindy Rollins often talks about reading stories with your kids and then getting out of the way, not preaching, not becoming the preacher because they're going to, tune you out. You're going to become like Charlie Brown's teacher or the wah, wah, wah. But if you're reading these good stories and you're just leaving them there, then those imaginations, those moral imaginations are going to kick in and pick up the pieces. And if you're constantly blanketing them with these really good, fantastic, well-written stories, we're not talking about moralistic drivel or anything, but really great tales, then that's going to seep into who they are as people and shape them.
100%. I totally agree with that. And Tolkien talked about, even for a storyteller, he talked about that. He talks about the origins of stories, and he talked about them, that the stories bubble up from the leaf mold of your mind, and that all the things that you've read and all the things you've done and all the places you've been. I talked about sort of that unusual combination of being an Appalachian and an African, sort of having a heritage of both of those things in a sense. And what kind of that's just produced something in me. I can't really describe it. I mean, I don't know what that's exactly produced. It's just something that's bubbled up. And so, yeah, I feel like it's just a huge advantage to be able to bring great storytelling to bear on the imagination, the vulnerable, impressionable imagination of a child or an adult. But I'm not responsible for the adults around here. I'm responsible for these kids.
Right. Well, let's start breaking it down a little bit and talk about compelling stories. What do you think are some ingredients for these kinds of stories that we're talking about? What do they need?
I think that's a cool question for you to ask somebody else, because I don't know the answer. Now, I think that's a good question. So I have, you mentioned Cindy Rollins talking about sort of overanalyzing and the dangers of that. And I'm like totally of two minds on both of these things. I totally agree that we are hungry for mystery and for beauty and for goodness that transcends like simple reductions of teaching, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, like I also think teaching is awesome. And like if you've ever met a kid, like they love things explained to them and they ask like, why did that happen? And that's totally awesome to me. Like I love that. I'm totally encourage that with my kids. In fact, they've got this trick that they pull like when it's getting close to bedtime, they just start asking me questions about like Napoleon or the film industry or Liverpool soccer or
your kids too.
Yeah. They do that. So it's awesome. And I'm like, I just can't make these kids go to bed because we are talking about really cool stuff here. But so I think curiosity is awesome. And I think like answering questions is really good. So I think we can overdo it on we're all poetry reading people with berets who don't live in the real world and just want to float away. And I think we're practical. And I know you're a home educator. Like you're very practical. There's things we just want to learn and kids are curious. And that's awesome. So I think just evaluating stories is hard in that it can be, I think too much, at least for me, it's hard. I've got to be careful about looking back and being too like clinical about thinking what elements of these stories work. So I just say that to qualify it as a really long and boring qualification for why I don't feel entirely satisfied answering a question like what ingredients are great. But I'll go ahead and say that I think there are some things that I think are great. But I do think there's something in that sort of that leaf mold, that porridge that is just goes beyond. I don't know what combinations make the recipe amazing, but I can tell you some flavors that I like. For me, I mean, there's some formulaic things about storytelling that kind of everybody knows, but it's surprising how often you don't see these in stories. But I think really big things are, raising the stakes, and that's something everyone talks about. But it's something often that little kids, when they're writing a story, which, it's not a big deal to discourage, so we don't want to discourage kids, but especially little kids. But early feedback is, well, this happened, this guy went into the onion patch and he found something and then he went over here, and they're kind of rambling and they're not connected. And so something that's really helpful is to say, well, what are the stakes? Like, what does the main character fear losing? How much pain are they in? How much are they? What are they threatened with? What are people they love threatened with? What are the stakes? And so early in a book or a story, you often have, you have the contract with the reader, and it's not, you don't write in the beginning like, hey, I'm going to fix things at the end. Let me tell you what's going to happen. But there is an unspoken, an unwritten kind of contract, and that starts with what's wrong with the world. So toward the beginning of the book, to get people's interest and to tell a good story, you have to let them know about the stakes and what's at stake and what can be lost and what's wrong with the world. And I think for it to be a satisfying story, you have to answer the question that you posed. You have to follow through on the contract that you have with the reader or the listener of the story. You have to tell them, you have to deliver on what you said you were going to do at the beginning, even though you didn't say it. So I think raising the stakes, having something like being very clear on that contract, on what's wrong with the world, is really, really important. And then I think causal connections. This is another big one. There's a bunch, and I'll just relate this story of how when I first wrote the Green Ember, the beginning, you might be able to see this from my long rambling answers, but I had sort of more of a rambling long beginning. And Zach Franzen, who I'm pretty sure you've met, Pam.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
A wonderful guy. He's the illustrator for my books. Just a really bright, brilliant man with fantastic hair. One of his critiques early on feels a little bit like, he said, maybe you could tighten up the causal connections. Like it feels a lot of times at the beginning of the story like you're writing, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. He said it would be better if it was, this happened because that happened, and then this happened because that happened, and then that happened because that happened. So this causal, this because thread running through the whole story, that feels like the difference between an expert or an adept storyteller versus someone who's just kind of finding their way in a story. And it doesn't mean it has to be really programmed, but just always thinking like that readers always kind of need a reason to keep reading, and not that you're treating them, not that you're doing things to, trying to exploit them. I actually don't like thrillers. I don't like books that make you, that are like manipulative. They never give you anything, but they ask a lot of your attention, but don't always give you a lot in like the heart. And but I do want to try to tell stories with a quick pace, and paces that end things where you want to, end a chapter where you want to keep reading the next chapter, and sort of like propelling the reader forward. Those are two things, Pam. I could probably go on, but I don't know. Are you asleep yet? Are you asleep?
No, I'm not asleep at all. I'm actually thinking about, that was one of the things when we read The Green Ember, was you just played havoc with our bedtimes around here.
I hear this a lot. This is bad.
We would get to the end of the chapter and they would, no, we have to find out what happens next. You have to read one more. And I would, darn that, Sam Smith. But yeah, I love that idea of having the contract with the reader and fulfilling kind of that obligation to them, but also leading them through the story and giving them a reason to continue reading. That's great. So a lot of times moms wonder, what book should I read with my kids? What should I pick up? How does the Smith family decide? And obviously, I think you have ends with a number of people and kind of know where to go with reading. But if you're just standing in the bookstore, what makes S.T. Smith pick up a book and take it home to read to his kids?
Well, I think that is great. And I think you probably get this too, that I don't feel like I have a lot of particular advantages over a lot of other people. I feel like I'm kind of in the same boat. We're a homeschooling family that's busy and tired and happy, and, we go through difficulty. And so I just say that we're the same way. We're standing in the bookstore and we're the library, and our kids are reading 8,000 books a day. And we're like, what can we do next? Where can we go? And you can only read the classics so many times. But I'm probably like you and like a lot of your listeners, I go to people I trust. And and we even started a website, Storywarrencom, that is sort of centered around that idea of like being a resource to families who are kind of concerned. The way I have talked about it is that it feels like there are two dangers that I want to be aware of and a little bit wary of. And I don't want to be like a big fearful, reactive homeschooling. I'm scared of everything. And so we're going to withdraw and huddle up in the basement. But also, I want to protect my kids, but I want it to be a shade, a shade like under a tree on a scorching day where there's openness and there's life and there's air and there's opportunity to thrive. I want my protection to be like that. But the two things that worry me a little bit or that I want to be wary of, or at least aware of, and I find some concern for, is that I think on the one hand, you have like a sort of a toxic, I don't know, as a Christian, as a devout Christian family, like there are things that we're not excited about our kids being exposed to, that we feel like are dangerous and exploitive, and at the very least inhospitable to the kids, and don't treat them as valuable and don't treat them as made in the image of God. And so there's some sort of toxic stuff that's like marketed to kids that is just astonishing to me. And I think, we don't want that. That's not great. It's not hospitable to kids. It's not welcoming. And then, so there's sort of that side, which I think a lot of Christians are tuned into, like being aware of that. But there's also sort of, like you talked about it earlier, I think this sort of moralistic, reductionist, didactic, drivel, or just sort of utilitarian, the people who are just using a storytelling merely as a vehicle to convey truth. And like, that's nothing against truth, because boy, I love truth. Truth is so powerful and so wonderful and such an anchor. But, I think that truth, beauty, and goodness need to be sort of used in measure in storytelling, and not when it's just truth and beauty is just sort of like a thin veneer to cover over that you just want to give a proposition, which I love propositions. I love propositional truth, that God is powerful, is true, I think, and God is loving, is true, and I want my kids to believe that. But when I tell them the story of Jesus, healing Jairus' daughter who's dead, then you get the whole thing. You don't even have to say he's powerful or that he's loving. You just see it in the story and you get it all. So I think some propositional just reduction, to just propositional truths can rob the truth of its sort of power, its reality. So I think on the one hand side, you might say the right, there could be a problem with that sort of reductionistic, like And I've described it as being safe for the whole family in a dangerous way.
And in a boring way.
Right. Yeah. Right. Not engaging. And so in between that gulf, which may or may not be real, but just for simplistic terms, in between that gulf, I think you have a lot of parents who are like, I don't really want to go either way. And sometimes you go from one to the other thinking, oh, this is just all this safe, boring stuff. So I'll just go over here to the edge and just take a swim in the septic tank and it'll be great. But that's not really the answer. And, in reacting from, oh my goodness, my kids are going to be exposed to this, to just like, I'm just going to do this really simple moralistic stuff that has no heart and no life. That's also dangerous. So I just feel like in between there's a tension there for us as a family. And I think that's why part of the reason we started Story Warren was to be an ally to parents who are in that situation like us, who are just saying like, well, I don't know what to do here. And how can we help? And of course, other allies like Sarah McKenzie, she's fantastic as a resource, the Read Aloud Revival and Story Warren and you. And so we listen to all you guys and try to pay attention. We can't keep up with all the reading. So I'm actually interested to hear what you say about this, but we do our best. We read a lot ourselves, a whole lot together, and we sort of stretch the permissive side of the equation as children become older and demonstrate responsibility in that kind of stuff. So that we feel a lot of good kind of pressure to be very intentional about walking beside them, along with them, and helping shape them and along the path of wisdom when they're younger, so that when they get a little bit older, that we can feel good about them, becoming sort of like having these trial runs at being adults. So that's our methodology. Is but I don't know if I don't know if that's very particularly helpful.
Well, I think you touched upon it in this conversation. The community is our biggest asset as parents. The community that we have together, and so often you have to kind of poo-poo Facebook or take a break from Facebook just to keep your sanity. There's so much kind of, garbage there. But also, as a homeschool mom, there's so much of my community there. And it's a great place for me to go and say, along with places like Story Warren and Read Aloud Revival, but to go and say, what can we read? Have you read this book? What do you think about this one? What do you think about this author? I have a boy who's 10 and he really likes knights and castles. What should he be reading? Or, and so it's such a huge resource. And I think it's our greatest asset, each other, and like-minded people. We really help each other out in that. So that's a lot of times that's where I go. And that's what I do when I'm looking for something.
That's so powerful. That's so powerful. I love that you said that. Because that's been my experience too about a lot of this kind of stuff. The adventure of being a storyteller even is that finding allies is such a gift. And one of the positive sides of this sort of what can be the cesspool of social media and connectiveness is that, hey, we're connected. We've got these wonderful connections to wonderful, beautiful, truthful, good allies that can stand by our side. Thanks for saying that. That's fantastic. I've enjoyed interviewing you very much.
You're nuts.
My next question for you is...
No, my next question for you is, let's talk a little bit about story and ritual. I mean, so often in our families, whether we're doing it morning time or we're doing it bedtime, we're pairing stories with ritual. Do you see a connection between the two?
No. Let's move on. Yeah, absolutely. I totally do. I think I think you're so right to say that. And yes, I think that's powerful. So powerful. I mean, the Green Ember itself, that's where it came from. It came from a habit, ritual, a relationship, and at bedtimes, at sort of taking a walk times, that's where those stories came from. So I'm a 100% believer in that. And, you and I come from a little bit different backgrounds, but sort of I come from a very, 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 well, I don't know, maybe we don't, but I come from a very, very low church, sort of like people who are a little bit afraid of ritual, afraid of the word, because thinking that it always has the idea of being very empty or just like, possibly false religion or that kind of thing. But just almost the whole experience of my adulthood and growing up has been like trying to re-understand that and seeing the unbelievable power of ritual and really just recognizing that that's what we are. we're those kinds of creatures. We're ritual creatures. We're habitual creatures, and we do the same things. And so, making those things count and making them, imbuing them with power, receiving them from the inheritance from the various places we can receive it from, not least maybe our faith. So even like Advent right now, the practice of Advent for our family has been a gateway to so much light for us, so much. I mean, we started that. We didn't even know what it meant. Like, what is this? Such a weird thing. And it's been so many years now. Our kids have grown up with this ritual that we do every night, with the candles, and we've kind of written some songs, and we do the certain readings, and my daughter will read from a certain book, and we sing and we read, and it is unbelievably powerful. And it's something that I would have thought, like, well, kids won't like that because it's all, ritual, but the kids love it. They absolutely love it. They look forward to it. Their eyes light up with the candles and the stories and the songs and the beauty and the quiet and the longing.
It's funny. It's funny because, first of all, I'm going to ask you, have you read any of James K.A. Smith, Desiring the Kingdom, and his talk about rituals that form us?
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to recommend that if you hadn't.
No, for sure. That's been huge, yeah.
But, kids are such creatures of habit. And so you were saying, I didn't think the kids would like that. But there's nothing more OCD than a toddler. I mean, they love... They love ritual. They really, really do. Yeah. And sometimes I think when Jesus talks about you have to become like the little child, maybe that's something that I'm not going to get off into theology because I always get that wrong, but that might be something that he's alluding to there, is that the ritual does, I think, really grow the faith.
Doesn't Chesterton say that too? He says, like, children say, do it again, do it again. And children don't mind that. There's the wonder of repetition. Totally agree with that.
What do you think it did for your kids to hear those stories over and over again? Maybe that's where I'm going. Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, that's absolutely profoundly powerful. Maybe nothing else as powerful. The formative power of those rituals, which are deeply connected to storytelling, particularly us seeing ourselves as characters in this everlasting story that's more beautiful, more good, more truthful than any story we'll ever tell each other, and that every good story echoes. To see ourselves in that story, and that Advent, that the formative rituals of childhood and of families are an invitation to meaning. They're an invitation to understanding, to wisdom, and to desire, to love, to passion, to seeing yourself for who you really are, to valuing yourself, but not centering on yourself. Or, I just feel like it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of these formative rituals, which is another reason why, your emphasis on the morning time and is so powerful, and it's such a powerful influence, because we've had evening rituals a lot of times in life, and they've centered around, studying the Bible, which is awesome. I love the Bible. I think it's amazing and fantastic, and not that it needs my endorsement, but just that, like our Advent time is fantastic. But this morning time that's been such a point of focus for our whole family, and of the ritual. It's unbelievable what they accomplish. Sometimes I'm working and I'll come inside. I've been working from home for a little while. I have this little office outside, but I'll come in to get a drink or something, and I'll hear them like reciting Shakespeare and listening to mom read. We've got little kids now too, so we've got sort of every age. So like we're going through the Narnia books again. So I hear her reading from Prince Caspian, and they'll be reciting something in Latin or whatever. And it has been a tremendous key for us. So I don't know. I don't know what to say. I just think that you're exactly right, that it's unbelievably powerful, and that we've, as Chesterton talked about, us sort of growing tired of repetition, and he talked about us, that we've sinned and grown old, and that our Father is younger than us, and that in a real sense, not anything against maturity, which the Christian faith would certainly be a lot about, of becoming maturity, but I think that maturity is being connected with the re-enchantment of the world and who we are. And so I feel like it's profoundly powerful.
Yeah, I like that. I'm writing that down, that whole re-enchantment with the world thing.
Well, make sure you give me credit.
I will.
Got to make a buck somehow.
I have to give you credit for re-enchantment of the world. And then, hey, Sam Smith endorses the Bible right here on my show.
Here first. A 5-star review.
I love it. Well, let's talk a little bit about some things that can sometimes be tough with stories. We want to give our kids clear examples of virtue, and we've talked about that a lot today. But a lot of times, some of the most interesting stories, some of the best stories, feature characters who struggle to do what's right. Why is it important to read about that struggle?
So that we often think about stories as vehicles or as maybe opportunities to inspire our kids to something bigger or better, to something. We see St. George and we say, wouldn't you want to be like that? And I think that is a completely awesome way to talk to kids and to think about stories. I think that's wonderful. And that's happened for me 1,000 times. But maybe almost more powerful in some ways is seeing some of these negative characters. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I want to have that even in my heroes, that there are moments, particularly with one of my characters, Pickett, in the first book, where I've heard so often from parents and who say, "Oh my goodness, that was really appropriate for us. That was really powerful for us to see what was happening with him, and for the description of him holding on to sort of bitterness and resentment, even when he knew in his mind that it was wrong." And I think that's a powerful thing, is because it's not always information that changes me as a morally, or inspires me morally. It's because I feel like I know the right thing, but I don't always do it. And I need more than information. And that goes back to our conversation about formation, about spiritual formation, about rituals and the powers of things we do repeatedly. But I've got to see it. I've got to see it, and I've got to inhabit it. I've got to walk a mile in the man's shoes who's walking the wrong way in order to sort of appreciate, oh my goodness, I don't want to be that. Oh my goodness, I am that. That's happened to me a lot. Is this guy's a bad guy, or he's a good guy making a bad decision, and that's just like me. That is just, I see myself. Oh, it's a mirror. And it's a mirror that reflects reality, and then therefore, inspires change for me. So I think it's deeply important and powerful to have those experiences as a kid and as a reader.
I think a lot of times we have this fear as a parent that we're going to put a character like that out in front of our kids, and they're going to say, "Oh, look, we can do wrong too." But I think so many times instead, they look at that character and they can relate to having those feelings because they're fallen and they've had those feelings before themselves. And then they see how it all turns out for that character and can make that connection between, this was not the right feeling to have. This was, they're not trying to emulate, but they're certainly identifying and having empathy with that character and understanding, hey, this person's like me. And now I can see that it's, because Pickett was never satisfied with his feelings there. He was grumpy.
Yeah.
He never felt good about what, these feelings that he was having and what was going on. And I think the kids could feel that too, could feel that frustration.
I hope so. I think that's exactly right. And this kind of goes back to sort of having storytellers and books, adventures that we can trust, that come from a good place. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like a lot of the TV and movies that I grew up receiving, that the storytellers were often positioning people who were deeply rebellious and very selfish as central characters and as like a really good path to follow. And I feel like that's such a, the opposite of that is not reducing everybody to these moral sort of equations where the good person, this happens, that doesn't really account for reality either, especially in the short term. I mean, that's one reason why the Bible is so fascinating, because you have just unbelievable breadth of stories of people doing, it's not always like, well, Johnny told the truth and then he got an apple at the end. It doesn't happen like that often. It's very tragic and very broad and very comprehensive as far as like the storytelling in it, but I just feel like the cliche of the rebel against everybody who's selfish and who is doesn't treat girls well, and he's really cool, and he's like a cold kind of a character that maybe was typified in the 80s and 90s. I don't know, that I feel like I saw a lot. Like, that's unhealthy too. It's not healthy. So I feel like I just want to emphasize the importance of sort of the character of the storyteller. There's a lot of power in how you represent things. It's like we can't even have a hero. Every hero, if you watch the Lord of the Rings movies, Aragorn, who is a little bit complicated. I mean, he is a Strider, and there's a dark, but the movie just basically turned him into, like, he just never stopped being Strider. He was always this sort of vagabond anti-hero who was unsure, and it was so different, such a contrast from Tolkien's vision. And the same thing happened with Faramir and other characters who just, it was almost like Peter Jackson could understand the darkness, could understand evil, and kind of a background in horror, but it was almost like the good characters were too good to be true, and so he was almost afraid to represent them for a modern audience because there was too much virtue there, and it didn't know how to represent that very well. And so I feel like that's just so it's important to me to be able to trust storytellers to frame those sorts of things and not lionize or glorify sort of like basic rebellion as being this untouchable virtue, which it feels like a lot of storytelling does.
Well, let's talk about fantasy versus reality for a few minutes, and fantasy stories versus realistic fiction, actually. We know that we've talked a lot about Narnia and Tolkien and things like that today as sparking the imagination. But what about stories like realistic stories like Charles Dickens or Ellen Montgomery? Can they wake us up to our moral imaginations just as much as Lewis and Tolkien?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's been very many stories that have spoken to me on a moral, inspirational, aspirational sort of level as Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, one of my favorite books of all time. I love it so much in so many ways. But yeah, I think what we could probably acknowledge is that sometimes stories that have elements of fantasy help us in that they help us see, again, going back to Chesterton, who just can't stop talking about because he just has so much insight about this stuff, is particularly his chapter in Orthodoxy called, I think it's chapter 4, The Ethics of Elfland, is so profound. But one of the things he says is that poets make the apples silver or gold because we have forgotten that they're green, and they make the rivers run with wine because we are not astonished that they run with water. So I think fantasy has a similar role as poetry in that it can often get past our intellects to show us something that's fantastic. And we respond to it in a way that we should be responding to the world as it is, the world as God made it, which is a fantasy world, which is incredible. And I say it over and over again, but we eat food from the ground. We frost our cakes, which are not necessary for survival, with sugar that comes from cane, it comes from grass. And we eat food from the ground. We get babies in this amazing way. I mean, and if you came to a world where that was happening and you didn't know that, or that wasn't your experience, you'd be like, oh my goodness, what is happening here? How do people, it's just an incredible, how do we survive? How do we thrive? How do we flourish? Well, we do it in this fantastic, unbelievably, magically wonderful way. And so I think fantasy has a way of letting us get outside of it. But that being said, it doesn't have to. It's not limited to that. If we can have eyes to see. And I think that there's a unique opportunity with fantasy to get around our, I don't want to misuse Lewis's quote about the watchful dragons, but it's kind of applicable with our intellects kind of get in the way sometimes. And when we can sort of do a short circuit or an end run around our intellects and get to our imaginations, I think we can become enchanted. We can be more awakened with enchantment in a way that some more realistic stories don't do. But that said, how many women have you met who have been unbelievably enchanted by Anne of Green Gables? I mean, I know about 8,000 of them myself, and myself as well. It's fantastic. I love it. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And the same thing can happen with Dickens in different ways. And The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorites, just an absolute favorite book. And it's not a fantasy, but it's fantastic. So I don't know the answer. I just feel like it's all valuable, and the fantasy has some unique advantages in that.
I think you're right, though. They're not fantasy, but they are fantastic. There's just something about a well-told story that does awaken your wonder with the world, even though everything in there is grounded in reality. But the experience of the story, being taken along by a master craftsman storyteller into that world and riding that wave of conflict and coming to that resolution and feeling satisfied, that contract between the author and the reader being well met. Mm-hmm. It can really turn us on to that wonder. And I love what you said about that. We live in such a wonderful world and we take so much of it for granted. I'm paraphrasing you now. To be reawakened to that wonder. And that's what stories do for us. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Tell me what you're up to. What's next for the Rabbits with Swords?
Well, I am glad you asked. It feels like there's a lot going on lately. We recently published a new short book called The Last Archer, a Green Ember story, which you mentioned earlier, and that's been really wonderful. It's set sort of at the same time as the first book, The Green Ember, and it follows sort of a side character. I really enjoyed it a lot. But we are getting ready to, I think, when this podcast goes out, we'll be in the middle of a Kickstarter for Ember Rising, the Green Ember Book 3. So the Green Ember, it was the first book, and then there was the Green Ember Book 2, Ember Falls, and then this will be the Green Ember Book 3, Ember Rising. We ran out of cool ideas for titles, so we just did the most easy thing possible. Okay, but so I'm really excited about that. I can't wait because we kind of, I feel like, I don't know how much I can talk about this, but
you can tell us everything. It's fine.
I can tell you. Okay.
Yeah.
But we have, so the first book was the Green Ember, and I think some people did feel like it left on a cliffhanger, but I sort of didn't agree with that too much. I thought that it was, as a character story, it had a good arc and a good ending, but and as an event story, the main event sort of happened. There was a climax, but then there was a little bit of a rising action at the end, and I thought it was more of like about possibility, kind of like Darth Vader, getting away at the end of Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie. You kind of like, okay, there's more to this story. I feel like with the second book, with Ember Falls, I sort of cashed in on a lot of the capital that I feel like I had from people being very, very supportive, and I told a difficult story, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think it did leave people a little more hanging, and it did too. I wanted it to be somewhat satisfying, but it left you in a challenging place, somewhat like The Empire Strikes Back. Ends with Han and Frozen in Carbonite, and I feel like just there's a lot of middle stories are like that, and book 3 is not the end; it is a middle story as well, this Ember Rising. But I feel like I'm excited about the opportunities that we've explored a lot with the characters, and so that people know the characters a lot better now, so that I think we can get to more of the action, let the story unfold. And I don't know, I really love this new one. It's longer. Quite a bit longer, and I'm very, very excited to share it. It's another middle one, but it's the action is moving, and I think a lot of reveals happen, and a lot happens for our characters, and so I'm very excited about it. I hope people will be interested in either backing the Kickstarter or buying it when it comes out.
So I was going to ask you, how can we take part in this? The first way we could take part would be to back the Kickstarter. And in doing that, we would have different goodies that we might have access to at different Kickstarter levels.
The Kickstarter is it's really about a story. We can publish the book. We did that with The Last Archer, and that was good. But the Kickstarter sort of framing allows us to sort of invite our allies and our friends to come along and be a part of the project. So we set a goal, and we get to do it all together. And it's where a couple of times, we've done it twice, and both times people have really showed up for us with a lot of enthusiasm. And yeah, I think it's a cool opportunity to get, you'll be the first people to get the book, for instance. And there's a lot of unique things. Like, people love the Efall Potter mugs that we do, and we have some special ones. Hopefully they're still there when this podcast comes out. But there's just several little we may have a new shirt, hopefully. And so I think there will be some cool goodies, that would be extra. And I think most important for us is that we it's kind of a tangible way for we get a lot of support, and a lot of people who write and say, oh, this was great for us and great for our family, and help my reluctant reader, or my kid was scared after this event, and walking through these characters was really valuable for us as a family. So we hear a lot of supportive things, and it's just kind of a way for people to just sort of very publicly help us, come alongside and say, hey, this author that we appreciate is sharing his new book, and we want to invite you into the series, and that's kind of a cool thing too. Is it's not just about this new book. It's not just a Kickstarter, because I think that people who want the new book will find the new book, but it's about it's an opportunity to share the series with the world, with trying to connect with more readers. So that's the way we kind of look at it. And it's been wonderful for us. We've had amazing allies, amazing friends, and really, really grateful for you, Pam, for inviting me on here and letting us have a really cool conversation. And thanks for letting me tell people about the Kickstarter.
Well, we are going to put a link to the Kickstarter in the show notes for this episode of the podcast. So you'll be able to find that there and can go over and check everything out. And so we're excited about this. And thank you so very much for coming on and chatting with me today about story and what it's meant to your family and what it can mean in a morning time for all these other families too. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Pam. It was a real honor for me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
And there you have it. Now, if you would like links to the books or resources we chatted about on today's show, you can find them on the show notes for this episode of the podcast. Those are at pambarnhill.com/YMB45. Also on the show notes, we have a direct link to that Green Ember Kickstarter campaign that we chatted about as well. So go over and check out the wonderful goodies they have over there and share that with your friends. Finally, if you would like to meet SD Smith in person this year, you can do that at the Great Homeschool Conventions. SD and I are both going to be speaking at all 5 of the Great Homeschool Conventions throughout the country. Both of us would love to meet you there. Find out more information about how you can do that. Have SD sign your books, your Green Ember books, or come up and just chat with me for a while in the vendor hall. And all the information you need for that one is at greathomeschoolconventions.com. So we'd love to have you join us there. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another great Morning Time interview. Until then, keep seeking truth, goodness, and beauty in your homeschool day.